So I have a pretty clear idea of what I would want to talk about next, but that has to
Okay.
take second place to anything that you've got on your mind as a central concern. Something you think is, I mean, you already brought up a couple of things. We've really gone over them heavily. Is
hmm
there another topic, or should I name what I think is probably the next step?
Yeah, I think let's go with yours because the next thing for me um, would be like advancement stuff, but I think that we can put that off to another conversation.
By the most remarkable coincidence, that is actually what I want to talk about.
Good. All right, that makes
But the
sense.
yes, but
Mhm.
I want to specify that advancement as such is, in my mind, a sub topic of the more general topic of change. So change, of course, can be about anything, and it can be positive or negative. Um, and so if we specify it to the characters in particular, it still is a lot more general than just improvement, right? It's sort of
Mhm.
uh, increase. So let's take a look at some of the different variables. One of them is what indeed are the variables that in most role playing games, um, you know, apply to the characters being played. But also, let's talk about what they're changing from. So if we, I mean, a starting character, and I want to start with the beginning, not just any character at any point during play, because a character and everything else about play at the beginning is just a promise. It's just, it's a risk. It's like, all right, I'm going to put the effort into this, and I'm going to sit down at this table, and I'm never getting these hours back. Right? That's
Mhm.
and so let's start with that at the most sort of. I mean, a character at that point is more hypothetical than real. They haven't actually walked and talked. And so,
Right.
so if we were to look at these aspects of a character, um, and I think that these are fairly generic aspects that can be expressed in hundreds of different ways. One is probably the easiest and quickest to identify is whatever you've got about a character, which is about them doing something and how well. So in lots of games, this could be a skill list,
Right.
but there or anything and everything that feeds into that. Um, so in a game like yours, we've got anything that goes into the die size for the hands die.
Mhm.
Um, and at the moment, um, yeah, okay, so there's those things. And then another thing I want to think more in terms of resources because they're spent, they're expended. They may recover or be earned again or something or bought again. Um, but but it's something that you expend. Um, in the older D&D, of course, we had spells that were used up as they left your memory. We had gold, right, that was spent. You have, well, those are two excellent examples of this kind of
Right.
resource type thing. Whereas your chance to hit with your longsword against a given armor class was in the first category that I'm talking about.
Mhm.
Hit points, obviously, are in the second category. So, what kinds of things do we have in this game that go to those two things? And there's a third as well. So, what? But we'll get there in a minute. So, what technically speaking are things that fall into the first category, the effectiveness category?
Yeah. So skills, and so I just call them skills, then expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the same thing, just being better at that thing.
Hmm.
Um, and and I guess overall, I mean, I guess that's really it.
As I recall, you didn't
Um,
have much in the way of sort of attributes. I mean, if you look across all those skills, you kind of get an idea of what the attributes are. Obviously, they're strong if they can do that. As I recall,
right,
that was right. So you didn't have like a whole array of derived numbers that all fed into a given a given spot. So okay,
right, yeah.
and then you also have in the sort of the resourcey area. Of course, we have the points, right? We have um, the RK and
RK
the
and
Fate
Vassal.
and Vassal, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But is that it? As I don't remember, and of course I know you've done some redesign as
Mhm.
well. So I don't want to rely on my memory. What about things like damage levels and stuff like that?
Um, so yeah, kind of. So like there's like an abilities, what I call it abilities, right? And those are a little bit of a grab bag of things. So they can, make a skill a little bit better than the top.
Mm-hmm.
They can give you more like an extra point from the top. These things, but those are slots. So that's kind of like a resource in of itself. So you can only have four slots,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And
So
so
ability
you
slots.
got
Now,
to
mm-hmm.
right. Um, and then the only other thing that can kind of like change your I guess her attitude would be the blights, like your flaws that
Right.
people can call on and manifest. So that's
Right.
really it.
And one of the things that is important about these categories I'm talking about is obviously they're not separate as rules. So, for example, you could have a spell in D&D with the kind we're talking about. You could have a spell that you use up, but the spell also has a certain effectiveness. Right? That's not hard to understand. And it's the same thing here. The fact that the slots are limited in number doesn't mean something in them can't change effectiveness.
Right.
So you basically have one rule or a very simple little array of rules, but conceptually they do split into their resources aspect and their effectiveness aspect. Okay,
Right.
so with that, then we have the third category, which is not fluff, or rather, insofar as it's fluff, we're not interested. But the position of the character in the social world, the status world, and the what condition are they in, world, where might we expect to find them because of these things, and what sort of problems might they have because of these things, and what attitudes may they have. And some rules are very hard and fast about those attitudes and others are not, which would position them literally relative to some situation. Um, so in your game, blights actually do have a bit of that quality, right?
Yeah. Right.
So the blights kind of cross the different features of the blight rules kind of cut across all these things, um, and so which is fine. And what else? I mean, you have where the characters come from. I mean, you're still working with pretty much the same setting. Is that right? With the
Right.
different
Right. Yeah. So
regions,
same setting.
right?
Right. So you have just the life path, right? The upbringings, as I call them.
Uh huh.
And then you have some background stuff, to kind of get you thinking about like I guess the backstory of the character.
As I recall
And
from what I read, and again, I don't know how much it's been pared down, but in many cases, you end up with a rather remarkably specifically situated character. I mean, you can work your way into being like a minor crime lord of this city, through a set of upbringings, or you can discover that you've been subject, for years to these horrid ritual practices which have turned you into something strange. I mean, in other words, you've got a social history here for the character, and sometimes that's very significant.
Yeah.
Um, so you can say, looking at many characters, well, I am a shaman of this tribe, and I have this history of, I was a captive of another tribe for a while, or stuff like that. I mean, it can be pretty elaborate, or that's not the word I want. It can be very strongly positioned. One of the things we talked about 2 years ago was the capacity for some of the life path choices to turn out generic rangers or generic fighters, and that really contrasted heavily with how how well positioned they were in most of the choices. But that was a while ago. Anyway, so I'm just remembering that that aspect of how strong positioning was in your game. Um, so that when you chose a few things, if you the more sense you made of it as you went to yourself, the better a character you ended up with. They I live here, I do this, was pretty well established.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so okay, given that we have, I think, a fairly coherent understanding of these across a character for this game, now we talk about change. Um, and I did want to ask, what about injuries? Is there sort of a limited number of injuries that the character can take, or a certain amount of, how does that work again? Because I don't recall that well.
Yeah. Yeah. So like that's something that totally changed.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because we had talked about a couple of years ago about the like how it wasn't so easy to die. Um, and it was something that was totally counter to what I was going for,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, so I redid that. So pretty much, depending on how poorly you roll, because most of the time, anytime that you fail, you're taking damage, and
Right,
if
I
you
saw
pass,
like
then you're
take a major defeat and
right. So you could have like two flesh wounds, a mortal or a mutilation, as I call it, and then a mortal wound, which kills you. So so if you roll a critical failure, you die if you don't have armor, something
right,
like that.
right,
Just one hit, you're done.
right.
Um,
Um,
so
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 the
you could be
sorry,
hit four times if you like. You could be hit four times if you roll like just
right,
barely.
right,
Normally like two hits and you're out.
right. So there is a wound capacity is probably maybe the way to look at it in a general sense, that a character is walking around sort of with a capacity to take some damage relative to the rolls, even if it's,
Right.
yeah. So it's, you can think of it as like 4 times 1, right? So if you take a
Mm.
4,
Yeah.
you're, okay. So all
Yeah.
right, let's see here. With all that stated, now let's take a character in your mind through a series of adventures, some of which have been framed by the game master, and others have been framed in some fashion through the use of the Adharma points, um, by by players, and we presume that having brought some Adharma into play through various desperate situations, that the world has changed a bit. So if we take a look at in fact, wait, the whole situation, you had the dimming, right? What were the terminology for the darkening or dimming of the world
Oh, me of the world or of a character?
of the world at the moment,
Okay, I just call it darkening the world.
darkening world, and then for a character
Yeah.
there are these levels of dimming. right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Which
what
I just, which yeah, I call this shade,
right
right? So
shade,
because you
that's
kind of
it.
like,
Right,
right,
right.
yeah.
The shade. And so that's actually a really big deal because it is definitely a positioning type thing, but it also affects these. I mean, it basically cuts across those categories of effectiveness and stuff like that, if I recall
Mm,
correctly. So, all right.
right.
Therefore, when we look at a character having gone through several of these adventures, and the adventures details are arising from different input from different people, um, what do we reasonably expect could have changed? And it may be different from character to character in the details, but what are the big variables of interest to you? Um, I mean, I can put one right now. You know, are they alive?
Mm.
Right. I mean, that's one thing.
Yeah.
We've got life and death. And what else? What are other? I mean, we look at this character. Let's say we're a living one, and what do we see
Mm.
that's different from when they started?
Well, I like to see a balance between, not a balance even, but like I want to see that the character has gotten better at the things that they're interested in getting better at.
Right.
Um,
So
whatever
skills
whatever
have
they choose.
increased in die size,
Right.
right?
Yep.
So
And
keep
then
going.
they got some more. Right. They got some more points to throw around to mess with the narrative a little bit more.
Hmm.
And hopefully we've messed with their blights and they have maybe another one or something like that. Like I want them to feel like they've sacrificed
Hmm.
who they are to get what they want.
And one thing that's kind of interesting is that no matter where they are in terms of shade, it's probably taken just as much effort to stay where they started as it was to change, right? Or rather, in other words, it's not like you can just tread water for shade. You're going to have to
Right.
work to end up wherever it is you've ended up, or
Yeah.
rather made
That's
some
yeah.
decisions. So shade is not a matter of going up or down. It's just the fact that you're somewhere, and that can be tracked to what happened in play. So, what about other social stuff? I mean, the events of play can change a character's social positioning, right? I mean, in their circumstances in the world.
Well, that's something that I've always seen work pretty well
Hmm.
because as the players are writing their books and they're making these choices, that propels them. So if they're writing about some NPC that they're interested in and that comes up in a book, then it changes. So
Yeah.
that's something that because like the game is set up so that the choice is always in your face.
Hmm.
So your relationships are always changing. Well, those sorts of things are
Right.
always moving.
Changes are absolute, or sorry, changes. Relationships of all kinds are obviously in that positioning, category. So that's exactly right. I totally see this that, and I remember the books now. I'd kind of forgotten about that. So we have, I think, a pretty good look at all the things that can occur. And there are now some kind of mathematical aspects to this. The first one is in terms of just points gained, and there's almost no wrong answer to this, but if it's the answer you don't want, then it's wrong, for your game. So in a very blunt fashion, what does the curve of these changes look like? And bearing in mind that if we track just one number and follow it, that's not a good enough answer. We want kind of a multivariate curve in your mind for all these things, right? So a given character may have changed in a different way from another character in terms of the details, but that's all right as long as to you they seem to have an equivalent amount of change across all these variables. That's good enough for me. in that light, of this sort of multivariate, I'm not going to use the math, the multivariate thing, right, that abstractly tracks all the possible changes for a character, overall, what does it look like as it goes up? I mean, is it linear, just goes up, at an angle? Is it start slow and then speed up? Does it start slow, or sorry, does it start strong and then level out?
Yeah, that one there.
Okay.
For most of the things